Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation I promised would be up this weekend on the website. This is the video presentation. I also am connecting the PowerPoint to the website, so if you'd rather go through the PowerPoint and not go through the video, totally up to you. Just make sure that you kind of understand some of the material we're covering in this. For example, know what the Connaught system is, understand the three major trade routes during this time period, understand the spread of religion. Those are the kinds of ideas that we'll go through in this presentation. So we're actually going to begin with long distance trade, and we're starting with the Silk Road. Part of what we're dealing with in terms of long distance trade is more than just trading for wealth and prosperity. It's also the trade of religious traditions and unfortunately the trade of disease. However, even though it's tragic in terms of the transmission of disease we see at this time, it actually helps some of these empires and civilizations later on in history. And I'll talk about that when we get to disease. So let's start with the Silk Route. The Silk Road, you guys know we've talked about before, starts way back during the Zhou dynasty in China. It becomes prominent during the Han dynasty. That's when we see the rise of the Silk Road really taking prominence during this time period. So it's during the classical era. It starts, you can see over on the right hand side of the screen at Xi'an, and then it splits apart. And that split apart happens at Duhuang, and we'll talk a little bit about what goes on in that city, especially with the spread of religion. And then it picks back up and becomes a single road at Kashgar. Kashgar kind of becomes this mediation point where you start having a lot of control of the Silk Road, taking it into the Mediterranean region. That's why, again, there's no connection between Rome, for example, and China until much later on in history because it's controlled, especially around Kashgar. There's major trade markets that take place there. And still, actually, to this day, there's a lot of trade markets that take place. So again, the route, it links China to the Roman Empire. Right in the middle of a desert, it splits apart. Now that desert is known as the Desert of Death. And because it goes on the outskirts of this desert, there are several different little oasis points that are set up, and these oasis points are rest areas for trade along the Silk Road. These become a major point of interest, especially for the spread of Buddhism, and we'll talk about that when we get to religion. But just remember that as it splits apart in the Desert of Death, or the Taklam Akan Desert, then it splits apart, creates these oasis rest stops for travelers and traders, and that becomes a major point, turning point for the spread of religion. So the branches, as I already mentioned, reunite at Kashgar, and this is in the corner of China, Western China, and it continues west into Bactria. Now, when you come upon this reuniting of the two branches, again, you see a major trade market. You can see in the picture over to the right, this is a photo from modern day, and there's still this market that you have at Kashgar. This is where a lot of the trade would happen. A lot of the mediation points would take place, where individuals from the Middle East, the Middle Empire. This includes people from India. It includes several tribes. It will later include the Mongolians. They take control here at Kashgar, and they're able to kind of control the wealth and what is actually spread from region to region. So in northern Iran, the route joins with roads on the Caspian Sea and Persian Gulf. Another thing that the route, the Silk Road, does is connects to major ports in the sea, and this helps expand some of the sea roads. So let's take a look at two of the major ports. First, you have Antioch in modern Turkey and Tyre in modern Lebanon. That's where it continues, and we're talking about this area of the world over here, specifically Antioch and Tyre. Antioch becomes major for the spread of Christianity, not necessarily Buddhism, but it's also a major trade point to get things up into Rome, because Rome at this point controls the Mediterranean Ocean or sea. The Silk Road provides access to major trade ports in the sea, which helps this maritime route in India, especially in India and Ceylon, which is modern day Sri Lanka. So some of the organization of the long distance trade that we see, you have individual merchants that did not travel from one end to the other. We've talked about this several times. But with the long distance trade happening in stages, you have the Chinese, then the Parthians, then the Persians, then the Indians, and the Romans. Several others, especially Persians and Indians, dominate that caravan. In the middle, the Indians will dominate the maritime trade. Geography determines what was exchanged because members that dominate the middle portion, they determine in essence what areas will receive what goods. Two of the major things that begin to be traded on the Silk Road from one end to the other are silk and spices. Those travel west from Southeast Asia to China and India. China at this time is the only area that the cultivators and weavers developed these techniques for silk fabrics, and they were in high demand, especially for those of upper class, the elite in the western part of the world. Spices became a major part of the Silk Road trade, and they'll be a major part for well over 1,000 years on the Silk Road because they're not only used for food, but they're used for drugs, anesthetics, aphrodisiacs, perfumes, all sorts of different things that are being used. So it's not just the silk, the spices used for food. And again, it becomes this major commodity that we find along the Silk Road that transfers to the Sea Road at the same time. Central Asia produces a large population of strong horses that they're able to trade. They also produce jade, and jade was highly prized by the Chinese stone carvers. Now, oftentimes they would trade jade, the raw material, and the Romans would take that jade in. They would then create jewelry, different works of art, decorative items with the jade, and they would trade that back out. That would become their export. So they would use an import to create an export that was highly valuable in the eastern part of the world, or Central Asia. And the Roman Empire was known for trading glassware, jewelry, decorative items, perfumes, bronze goods. They did some with wool and linen textiles, but more so they're known for pottery, iron tools. And then, of course, you know from your summer reading, olive oil and wine were huge export commodities for the Roman Empire. So this is a good slide to kind of know some of those evidence pieces that are good to know for your writing, for comparison and CCOT writing. China, you have silk, bamboo, mirrors, gunpowder, paper, rhubarb, ginger. Siberia, some of the biggest commodities you have there, furs, amber, livestock, horses especially. You have hides, copper vessels, and tents. You also have saddles, and you begin to see the trade of slaves. In India, cotton, and cotton becomes a large commodity for India, it still is to this day. Herbal medicine, precious stones, and spices. In the Middle East, you have dates, nuts, almonds, dried fruit, swords. And in the Mediterranean, you have gold coins, and a lot of the gold from the Mediterranean comes from Africa. We'll talk about the Saharan trade in just a moment, but a lot of the gold comes from Africa. Then you have grapevines, jewelry, artwork, perfume, olive oil, linen textiles. That's what you see from the Mediterranean. So again, this is a great slide just to get an idea for information on each region and what they were trading at that time and what they contributed to commerce. This brings us to the sea roads. The sea roads, again, would not have happened, a lot of historians believe, if not for the Silk Road, because the Silk Road linked trading ports. And by linking those trading ports on the sea, in order to make the journey or traveling a little less harsh on individuals, make it quicker, to get the money coming in faster, once maritime trade and once sea travel was perfected in certain areas, it really helps some of the sea trade take off. This is what we see in terms of areas of the world, especially in the Mediterranean. You have the Phoenicians, and they're a major trade state from about 1550 to 300 BCE. And they're the first to use polar navigation, the polar star for navigation, and they're really kind of a trucking company. They help import things from different areas, especially in terms of picking up from one port, dropping off from the Silk Road, and taking it to another port across the Mediterranean. Then you have Carthage, and Carthage becomes a huge route. It's a colony used by Phoenicians. Again, in the Mediterranean area, it's known for picking up goods, almost acting like a trucking company as well. A lot of their economic policies focused on protection of the sea lanes, and they secure natural resources. Carthage was known for great naval military power, and they were known as a great seafaring people. Then you have the Greek city-states. The colonies, and we're talking about pre-Athens, but the colonies, they act as bases for trade. They relieve a lot of the population pressure because it's a much larger area. They provide food for the mother city-state. And Sparta, interestingly enough, to emphasize the equality that we see in Sparta, they banned precious metals and coins and they don't engage in commerce. So they are kind of isolating themselves, which is one thing historians believe may have eventually led to their downfall. Not only population among the creation of Spartan military and just the Spartan population, but also this isolation tactic that they had. The Athenian trade, when Athens takes off, because of the size of their navy and the size of their ships being relatively small, they're able to power a lot of commercial interests. They're able to form the Delian League as part of a trade association, and they're able to export wine and oil specifically. And again, they really act as this mediator between two different ports. Because of the speed of the ships, they're able to get commodities from one place to another relatively quickly. Alexandria, which is part of the Hellenistic civilization that we talked about this week. The Greek culture was widespread. It was based on the empire of Alexander the Great. The city is named after him. He builds Alexandria, and it becomes this middle point, this nexus of Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade. And this happens through the Red Sea specifically. In Alexandria, it's a planned city that's actually built by Alexander the Great. That's why it has his namesake. It's dominated by a huge lighthouse. It's a huge port city where you have Romans taking wheat back to Rome from Alexandria. You have glass, papyrus, textiles, ointments, gems, and spices that are all traded through this port from India, from China. And it's also famous for the university and library, the library which would be burned a little bit later. Rome. Rome is known for its central location in this region, and that has a positive impact on trade. You have expansion through Rome, and it brings in revenue of these surplus goods. You have the provincial towns that draw in artisans and merchants from all over, and a lot of the commodities that they put out, especially in terms of the artisans and the jewelry and the art, it becomes a major export for Rome. Just by looking at this map, you can see where some things are coming from. For example, it makes sense that you'd have Alexandria in Egypt that's trading a lot of grain to Rome during the Hellenistic period. Then you have wine and honey from Greece. We're looking at this region, the Mediterranean region. A lot of the grain that's being traded up into Rome comes directly from Africa. You also have slaves, you have gold, you have purple dye, which is used at this time mostly for nobility, for the elite. From Spain, you have slaves, gold, copper. Again, that's coming from Africa, so we're talking about this region. And again, Rome, gold, wine, and slaves that are coming from the north. And then you go over to China, you see silk still being a major commodity for China. And then down here, you have Arabian perfumes, oftentimes done with the spices that are harvested from India. So in this region of the world, in the Middle East, you have spices and gems coming from India, creating perfumes in Arabia and being traded out. The Roman grain trade we already kind of talked about. You'll notice in Alexandria, it comes directly to Rome. Then you know from Carthage, it comes to Rome. And from Spain, it's coming to Rome, much of which is coming directly from Africa. And at this time, the Roman Empire extends into North Africa. They've taken Carthage. This is the battle against Hannibal. They've taken Alexandria, part of Egypt, Asia Minor. You have barley coming from this area of the world, wheat coming from Arabia, and then from Gaul, you have grain as well. The Indian Ocean trade is probably the most important of the sea trade networks. And part of this, what made it difficult, was the monsoon. The monsoon changes were crucial. For example, from November to February, it blew to the southwest. From April to September, it blew to the northeast. So it was dependent upon the monsoon and the wind changes, which led to new technologies and new inventions. And we'll get to the Dow in just a moment. Not the Dow like the stock market, but the Dow is in the ship. Sea transport becomes cheaper. More bulk goods are able to be traded at this time because of the size of the Indian Ocean. So you have textiles, pepper, timber, rice, sugar, and wheat. and the trade was between towns and cities, not states. So again, the speed in which the ships could travel made it much easier in the Indian Ocean because of a fairly straight path from one port to another. Here's an example of the trade routes. So you have the Indian Ocean, you have routes of colonization to Madagascar, you have the monsoon winds, but especially with the trade routes, notice where things are coming from, how quickly you're able to travel around. Now for the Indian Ocean, it's the first ocean to be crossed. It's the sailor's ocean. You have warm water, but again, the wind plays a role, which helps in the creation of lateen sails. The lateen sails allows these sailors to cross the Indian Ocean at a quicker speed. They're able to sail into the wind, and the lateen sails become popular with the dhow ships. These come directly from China, and most scholars believe they originate anywhere between 1,000 years, but many of them have the ships originating as far back as 600, the beginning of the classical era. And the dhow ships with the lateen sails are able to sail against the wind, so no matter what time of year it is, they're able to conduct trade in the Indian Ocean. Some of the products that contribute to the commerce from the Mediterranean, again, you have ceramics, glassware, wine, gold. Many of these are very similar to what you see on the Silk Road. It's done quicker. Some of them can be a little bit larger. For example, from Africa, you notice even animals like elephants being traded at this time too. But specifically from East Africa, which has direct influence on Indian Ocean, you have ivory, you have gold, iron goods, slaves, tortoiseshells, quartz, leopard skins. In India, grain, ivory, precious stones. Southeast Asia, sandalwood, cloves, nutmeg, mace. So you can trade a lot of different goods and you can trade them relatively quickly at this time as well. The last of the three routes are the sand roads. Exchange across the Sahara, we're dealing with Africa now, and Africa is kind of coming into its own at this time in terms of taking part in the trade. It begins in West Africa. The north of Africa manufactures goods like salt, horses, cloth, and dates. And they use the horses specifically as trade goods because horses aren't good in the desert crossing things like the Sahara, so they actually use camels. And they're one of the first to use camels. Camels are kind of like the ships of the sand is what they're called. And in their caravans, they have as many as 5,000 camels traveling in the caravans, which are able to bring some of the goods like salt and cloth um, across Africa. The south had crops like gold, ivory, kola nuts, slaves that were also brought through in these caravans. And you see the rise of a number of states that are directly connected to this trade, and it helps grow wealth in many of these states. Two or three specific ones actually we're going to talk about is in the Western and Central Sudan. We're going to discuss during the post-classical era Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Those are three of the most major areas in Africa, in the Central and Western Sudan that really benefit from this trade. Here's a map. You have the Kingdom of Ghana about 1,000. That's shown in red right here. The Kingdom of Mali and the trade routes across the Sahara. Notice how they kind of move from this portion of Africa up north. And this is how they're really able to take part using the camels or the ships of the sand, traveling through Timbuktu, which becomes a major trading port, especially during the Songhai Empire that we'll talk about post-classical. So you have a series of these powerful kingdoms. The West African kingdoms kind of control the important trade. So again, they almost become this mediation site the same way you have the Persians and the Mongols and the Indians controlling the middle part of the Silk Road. You have these areas like Timbuktu and Gao, which kind of control the trade coming up from the south and then going up to the north. So they're able to grow their kingdoms, and that's what helps them grow, especially the Songhai, which again we'll talk about later. This is the beginning of the Trans-Saharan trade route. North Africa was rich in salt, West Africa lacked, West Africa was rich in gold. So through this Trans-Saharan, they were able to trade back and forth, especially in terms of gold. And this is really what becomes important in this area of Africa when we start dealing with the slave trade coming to the Americas as well, because the slave trade, of course, most of those are traded from North Africa and West Africa and brought over to the Americas. So we'll talk about that much later when we get into post-classical. So again, the important goods that you see. West Africa provides the ivory, kola nuts, slaves, and gold, and in return they receive horses, cloth, dates, and different manufactured goods, as well as salt. New technologies, and this is a good piece of evidence for this as well. You have saddles and stirrups. The horses, and especially camels, could go for about 10 days without water. And then improvements upon the lateen sails and the dhow ships, which come from China earlier on. So let's move to the spread of religion and how the trade routes actually helped influence this. We've talked about Buddhism, so I'm not going to spend much time on that, but you know, just as a reminder, that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, first announced the doctrine publicly in 528 in India. By the 3rd century, Buddhism was well established in northern India, so it became that philosophy. And it was attractive for merchants and converts because of its denial of the caste system in India. So you have a lot of merchants who carry Buddhism and the tenets of Buddhism along the Silk Road. That's where it's first established its presence in different oasis towns. Remember when I talked before about the splitting of the Silk Road around the Desert of Death? You set up a lot of oasis towns around that Desert of Death in different rest stops. You begin having towns spring up, merchants with their caravans stop for food, rest, lodging, and a little Buddhist conversion at the same time. One of the most major spots is the initial starting point for the split of the Silk Road, and that's Donghuang, which is one of these spots. This becomes a major area, and here's the city circled. When it divides in these branches in the 4th century, it has a huge Buddhist community that emerges, and that becomes kind of a central conversion spot for Buddhism. So between 600 and 1000 in the Common Era, you have Buddhists which have built hundreds of cave temples around this area, around Donghuang, depicting scenes of the Buddha. You have assembled libraries, you have religious literature, scripture. You're starting to see the differences between the schools of Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravada. It supports missionaries which spread Buddhism throughout China. And you also see this on the Silk Road itself. You see several statues along the Silk Road of the Buddha that have been carved. Massive statues. If you take a look at this bottom statue right here, it's amazing the size of some of these. This was actually a picture on one of the AP tests a few years ago. It showed the picture of the Buddha, this particular picture right here, and asked, the question was really about how does this statue of the Buddha along the Silk Road demonstrate diffusion? And I can't remember what the options were, but again, the diffusion of religion and trade routes were very popular for transforming Buddhism and spreading it. With the monasteries in the rich oasis towns, they begin to become secular. They're very wealthy. Again, you start to see branches of Mahayana, which is kind of this original Buddhism that sees the Buddha as a great teacher. It flourishes along the Silk Roads. And you begin to see the springing up of Theravada Buddhism, which is established in Southeast Asia by missionaries sent out by Ashoka, which we've studied. Theravada kind of sees the Buddha as this divine figure. And you see the branching of this in many ways because of the several gods that you see incorporated from Hinduism, from several other nomadic faiths, from Greece, because you have the influence of Alexander the Great and the statues of the Buddhas. With all of this diffusion, you begin to see the incorporation of the Buddhist practice of the bodhisattvas, and the bodhisattvas kind of being these divine figures in Buddhism that didn't exist before. So when you didn't have divinity in Buddhism prior, you're starting to see it because of the diffusion taking place along the Silk Road. You see the same with the spread of Hinduism. Hinduism, particularly with the sea routes, begins to spread along the Silk Road and in the sea lanes, especially how it spreads from India to Malaya at this time. And it starts to bring about these Brahmin priests. Spread of Christianity is no different. Antioch, which is one of those port cities that the Silk Road stops at, is kind of this western terminal or terminus of the Silk Road, and it's definitely important for Christianity. A quote from Acts 11:25-26 in the Bible: "Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. This is St. Peter's Cave Church at Antioch. So this is one of the places where, for example, Paul begins his missionary journeys, and he begins the spread of Christianity at this time. Like the other religions, it follows the trade routes. It expands especially in the east throughout Mesopotamia, Iran, as far away as India. It doesn't necessarily spread at this time as far as China, but the greatest concentration is the Mediterranean basin, where it begins spreading from Rome up north. And it spreads north more so than along the Silk Road. And they use the Roman road for this. The very same way the Silk Road's being used, the Roman roads are used. It provides transportation. It provides a very active route for missionaries to spread Christianity. Here's just another example of Paul's visit to Thessalonica. And Thessalonica was the principal city of Macedonia. It was located at the intersection of these Roman roads. And again, it helps lead both eastward and when you start looking at kind of this northeast trek that it takes up to the Danube and the Aegean Sea, you can definitely see the spread of Christianity taking place. Here's just a map of the three faiths: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity. It's great. It's in color. You can kind of see the spread. Buddhism spreads far north. It spreads over into China. Christianity spreads as far as India, and up here just north of the Hindu Kush, and then up north again into Gaul. And then, of course, Hinduism kind of spreads along with Buddhism down here into Southeast Asia. The last of these is the spread of disease, which is definitely the most tragic, but again helps in the long run. It leads to the spread of disease because you have missionaries, you have merchants, you have people trading from different areas bringing disease that other cultures had not yet been exposed to. You have a few of the most lethal junctures where unfamiliar diseases arrive in this new culture. For example, in Athens, they hadn't seen an infection of things like smallpox and measles, and the infection is spread up from Egypt in 430 and 429. The Antonine Plague from 165 to 180 is another plague of smallpox and measles brought back from the Roman Empire, and its most famous victim was the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who succumbed to smallpox. The disease breaks out again 9 years later, and a Roman historian, Cassius, reported that 2,000 deaths a day were happening in Rome, and from this outbreak, it's actually been estimated there may have been 5 million deaths that took place. You see the same thing happening with the bubonic plague. Between 534 and 750 in the Common Era, long before we know of the bubonic plague taking most of Europe, a third of Europe, you have different outbreaks of it in areas of the Mediterranean that had not been exposed. Constantinople, for example, lost 10,000 a day for 40 days in 534 in the Common Era. So it wipes out vast populations. And then, of course, the worst outbreak that we'll talk about in post-classical, part of the catastrophic 14th century, is the outbreak for 4 years that takes about a third of Europe dying from the plague. Moving on from disease, you also have the spread of crops becoming popular in different parts of the world, which would then become very important for that process of globalization that we see spreading into the 19th and 20th centuries. You have rice and cotton, which is spread from South Asia to the Middle East. And because of the spread of crops, you need new irrigation systems, which is when we get to the Qanat system. The Qanat system is first used in the first millennium. It's used early on before the Common Era, and the Persians start constructing it actually. It's a tunnel system where you have individuals actually climbing down these vertical shafts that are sunk at different intervals, 20 to 30 meters. And they remove excavated material, they provide some source of ventilation, and they provide access for repairs. The main Qanat tunnel is sloped gently to have kind of this outlet in a village. From there, canals would distribute water in the fields for irrigation, which really helps when you have dry spells. And a lot of the Qanat systems are still used from as far east as China all the way to Morocco in the West, and even in some areas in the Americas, especially in South America in modern society. So the Connaught system is huge for the distribution of water from dams and channels during dry periods in order to keep crops growing, and by keeping those crops, you're able to keep trade going, so you don't have a dry spell. So the last slide that we'll talk about to kind of end this presentation are changes in continuity that we see during this time period. So big changes that we see during the classical age. You move from this barter system to a coin system for exchange. This especially becomes important when dealing with the trade routes that are springing up and becoming more popular. You have a greater interaction between civilizations, so you have more diffusion going on. Direct links between Rome and China, even though they don't meet directly, you have these links that are taking place between the two cities through their artifacts, through their commodities. Cultural diffusion through trade, you have the spread of religion, architecture, and the spread of disease. Now, what happens with the disease is that much later in history, when these diseases begin to be spread, you don't have people that are succumbing to the diseases in Europe and Africa and the Middle East as much as you do in the Americas, because they've already had exposure to them, so they've built up immunity. For example, during the slave trade and during the conquests of Spain and Italy in the New World, you see disease being brought over from Europe, especially, and killing off many of the Americas, killing 80 to 90% of the population because they had no exposure. But when they moved down and started exploring parts of Africa, Africans had already been exposed to that from much earlier on, so they had immunity to these diseases. So unfortunately, as tragic as it seems, it actually helps in the long run. You also have a decline in trade in Europe after the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome splinters things apart. Constantinople, for example, begins a major trading port, and we'll talk about that with Justinian I, starting in the post-classical era, where it kind of becomes its own trade route that eventually leads to its own area, its own split of Christianity becoming Orthodox. Some of the continuities that we see. Dominance of India in trade. Again, being a middleman, especially in the sea trade, it's huge for India. Then you have the importance of the Silk Road and Constantinople as a Western trade hub. That stays continuous through this age, and again we see changes in terms of its growth, and it becomes a major power player in the post-classical era, but it stays kind of continuous through the classical area as a major trade hub. So I hope you've been able to get some stuff from this presentation. This is all stuff that we'll continue talking about as we move into post-classical. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all soon.